we have an exciting show today. We're going to be talking to Jonathan McLatchie, and he just recently debated, maybe I think about 3 weeks ago, he just recently debated, people know him as a cosmic skeptic, but his name is Alex O'Connor, and he's a young individual, very young for his apologetic abilities, and he's very popular on YouTube. So again, thank you for joining me. If you can, take time to go ahead, share and like this page. So this information get put out there. You know, as you know, on the Gospel of Truth, we are engaging the culture with Christian truth, and a part of that is being able to spread this information out to the masses and be able to engage the culture and be able to talk to these individuals who may have a different worldview. And at center line always is the gospel, hence the name, the Gospel of Truth. But with that said, I want to go ahead and introduce my guest today. Like I said before, his name is Jonathan McLatchie, and he is an established apologist. I mean, I think he had over 20 or 30 apologetic efforts. Actually, I think he has 26 moderated debates. Let me give you a rundown of them. John McLatchie is a Christian writer, international speaker, and debater. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors in forensic biology, a master's degree in evolutionary biology, and a second master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience. Currently, Jonathan is completing his PhD in cell biology. Jonathan is a contributor to various apologetic websites, including crossexamine.org, the Christian Apologetics Alliance, and answeringmuslims.com. He is also a contributor at Evolution News and Views, the official blog of Discovery Institute. He is a founder of Apologetics Academy, a ministry that seeks to equip and train Christians to persuasively defend the faith through regular online webinars, as well as assist Christians who are wrestling with doubts. Jonathan has also been interviewed on podcasts and radio shows, including Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio, Line of Fire Radio, Apologetics 315, The 1 Minute Apologist, Dogma Debate, and many others. He has also been featured guest multiple times on ABN Sats Trinity channel, discussing issues pertinent to science and faith, as well as Islam and Christianity. Jonathan has participated in a total of 26 moderated debates, 17 formal debates, and 9 radio debates. Jonathan has spoken internationally in Europe, North America, South Africa, promoting an intelligent, reflective, and evidence-based Christian faith. Let me bring on Jonathan real quick, and so we can see him face to face instead of me just talking about him. Hold on one second. How's it going, Jonathan?
Hey, I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for joining me on the Gospel of Truth. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I'm glad it is, man. Yeah, man. So, as you know, I want to bring you on to discuss your debate with Alex O'Connor. And I reached out to Alex O'Connor to try to get Alex O'Connor on here, and I have heard nothing. I guess he's really busy. I know he's studying in Oxford, and he's pursuing his degree. So I can imagine how busy he is. But since I saw your debate, I wanted to get the feedback from you and see how that debate went and where you think were your strengths and things like that, and where you think were his weaknesses and things like that of his worldview. I'm sure there are many, so I just want to ask several questions just to sort of pick your brain a little bit.
Absolutely.
All right. So you're over in Austria right now, right?
No, I'm in the UK.
UK. That's right. So, yeah, man. I've never been over to the UK. Hope one day I might be able to go to the UK. So the weather over there is probably cloudy right now, raining, snowing. What is it?
Yeah, it's been sunny earlier today. It's a bit cloudy at the moment. I actually just got back from Austria this morning. I was there for a scientific conference in Austria, so I'm just arrived back in the UK today. But it was much hotter in Austria. It was between 27 and 29 in Austria over the last several days, so it's a bit cooler here in the UK.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I'm over here in California, so California weather, and the desert might I also add. So California is a little warmer, so good weather.
Right.
Yes. So give us a rundown of your ministry. What exactly is your ministry?
So my ministry is called the Apologetics Academy. You can find it online at apologetics-academy.org. And I do a number of things. One of the things I do is I run regular online interactive webinars with scholars, thinkers, and other Christians, and I also do a number of other things. One of the things I do is I run regular online interactive webinars with scholars, thinkers, and other Christians, and I also do a number of other things. One of the things I do is I run regular online interactive webinars with scholars, thinkers, and other Christians, and I also do a number of other things. One of the things I do is I run regular online interactive webinars with scholars, thinkers, philosophers, apologists from across the theological and philosophical spectrum. I bring on various speakers of different worldview persuasions to give us to deliver presentations on topics of interest to Christians, especially those topics which pertain to the question of, is the message of the gospel true? And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews as well, including Mormonism, Islam, and so forth. And then after the speakers have delivered a presentation, usually about an hour, we open up to open floor dialogue and debate. And so it gives people from all over the world the opportunity, from the comfort of their own living room, to interact with some of the top scholars in the world on topics that matter, especially pertaining to the veracity of the Christian faith. So that's one of the things I do. I also mentor Christians who are wrestling with doubts. I have an online service which I offer. People can submit a form on my website and to tell me about the doubts that they struggle with in regards to the veracity of the Christian faith. And I set up online meetings to discuss their doubts with them in confidence. And I also try to give people a protocol or help people to develop a protocol for working through doubts that they experience in regards to the veracity of the Christian faith. And of course, I also travel around doing speaking engagements. And as you mentioned, I do a lot of debates as well with Muslims, with atheists, and people of other religious stripes and none.
All right. That's pretty amazing. I guess you're a very, very busy man, and that, that's the goal, right? To have a ministry of apologetics that keep it gospel centered and be able to help individuals who are dealing with those issues of doubt and those things of that nature. So I applaud you on your ministry and what you're doing out there to get the gospel out there, and that's truly appreciated. Apologetics is definitely a medium where the gospel can be sent out through, and hopefully God is changing hearts with that. So I definitely applaud you on that, and I definitely am appreciative of your efforts of doing that. So let's get into the whole debate, right? So the debate was maybe an hour. Is about a little over an hour long, and the subject was why I am a Christian or why I am an atheist. Is that correct?
Yeah, the topic was why I am or am not a Christian.
Got you. Okay. So in the opening statements of your debate, you opened with I guess your reasoning was the resurrection of Christ. The evidence for the resurrection was the emphasis of your opening statement, and that's what that was, I guess, your reasoning for being a Christian, right? So why go with that? Because there are many areas I'm sure you could have touched on of why you're a Christian. Why go with that instead of something like the moral argument or the laws of logic or something like that?
So I only had 10 minutes for my opening statement, which is not a lot of time. So I had to pick something to major on and focus on. And the resurrection of Christ, of course, is something that gets to the real heart of what Christianity is. There's lots of arguments for why God exists. There's the various scientific apologetic arguments, including the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the argument from biological complexity and design, etc. But these don't really get you as far as the truth of the Christian worldview. They only get you as far as the existence of an intelligent creator behind the universe and behind life. And since I only had 10 minutes, I wanted to focus on something which would demonstrate the veracity of the Christian faith specifically, not just generic theism. And so I decided to focus on the resurrection. Obviously, my reasons for being a Christian are much more multifaceted than that. And indeed, I only was able to scratch the surface, not even that, with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. I've got many, many hours of content I could have delivered on the resurrection itself. Other arguments that bear on the truth of the Christian worldview include the arguments from predictive prophecy, both messianic and non-messianic, the arguments from the unity of Scripture, what I call intricate harmonies that run throughout the text of Scripture over centuries, across genres, across different authors, etc., and arguments bearing on the historical reliability of the Scriptures, both the Old and New Testaments, etc. So there's many different lines of evidence that one could look at to demonstrate the veracity of the Christian faith. But as I said, I only had 10 minutes, and I had to really major on something. So I chose the resurrection, which I think is a very strong apologetic argument.
I do too. I do agree that the resurrection is a very strong apologetic argument. I know that O'Connor, he tried his, I guess his attempts were to illegitimize the resurrection by pointing out that there's really no evidence outside of the Bible except for Josephus for the resurrection of Christ. And as soon as he said that, I was like, that's just absolutely false there. You know what I mean? That's absolutely false. So I really wanted to dive into your mind and see what you were thinking at that point in time when he mentioned that.
Well, I actually agree with him on that point. I think that we certainly have references to Jesus outside of the New Testament in the first century or in the early second century. We have Flavius Josephus, as you mentioned, the Testimonium Flavianum, Antiquity of the Jews. Cornelius Tacitus in the early second century mentions Jesus. But I don't find those sources as strong as the primary sources that we find in the New Testament, because those are secondary or tertiary sources. Josephus and Tacitus most likely received their information concerning Jesus from Jesus' own followers or from the early Christians. So I find the testimony of the New Testament to be much more persuasive evidence in regards to the life of Jesus. But there's really no evidence pertaining to the resurrection, or at least directly relevant to the resurrection, that we find outside the New Testament. That's not to say that we don't have good evidence. It's just to say that most of or almost all of the evidence for the resurrection is to be found in the New Testament. And I think we have a strong case that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. And so we have to take seriously, as I argued in the debate, that their testimony concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection experiences derive from the testimony of the earliest apostles themselves. But I'd be curious to find out what evidences you think bear on the resurrection outside of the New Testament.
Yeah, I guess I was pointing to the whole idea of just having evidence of Christ's death. I guess that doesn't directly correlate or directly pinpoint the understanding of Christ's resurrection, but I was pointing to more like you mentioned Tacitus, the Roman historian who actually documented the death of Christ, or said that he was put to death, if you will.
Right, but I think Tacitus is getting his information from others. He wasn't an eyewitness. In fact, he didn't even live when Jesus lived, right? He was born in 56 AD, died 117. And Josephus was born even a few years after Jesus died, so they were not contemporaries of Jesus. But we have writings of contemporaries with Jesus in the New Testament. So there's one possible argument you could make from Tacitus that's relevant to the resurrection. That is, Tacitus says, he speaks about in his Annals of Imperial Rome, he speaks about the great fire that broke out in Rome in AD 64, and how Nero, there was a rumor circulating that Nero had initiated the fire himself, or ordered the fire himself. And Tacitus says that all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods could not squash the sinister belief that the conflagrations were the result of an order. Tacitus reports that consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and subjected the tortures a class of people hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Mm-hmm. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every corner of the world find their center, become fashionable, etc. Now, I noticed that Tacitus says that the Christian movement was thus checked for the moment by the cross, and then it broke out again, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in Rome. And so you have the Christian movement seems to die down after the crucifixion, and then suddenly it explodes again in Judea, which was exactly the place where Jesus was crucified and where his tomb was, and so that bears on the resurrection, I think. But I think that the strongest and most decisive lines of evidence bearing on the resurrection come from the New Testament itself.
Yeah, and I also noticed in the debate that O'Connor, I don't know if I was right as far as considering it a fallacy, but I was thinking that it might have been a fallacy in his comparison with. Because he made the statement like somebody who might have resurrected is not necessarily divine, And I'm like, okay. I said, okay, if somebody resurrects from the dead, yeah, he'll probably get my attention. He'll probably definitely get my attention. I want to hear what he has to say. So, and he made the statement, well, what if somebody, he resurrected from the dead and he has a moral issue, something morally, moral defilement or something like that. But I thought the comparison was kind of off base because of who Jesus actually claimed that he was. And I thought that analogy kind of failed him in that part of his argument. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a few points there. One is that on numerous occasions during Jesus' earthly ministry, he said that the resurrection from the dead on the third day would be the ultimate vindication of his own radical self-claims, his claim to be the Jewish Messiah, and indeed his claim to be the Son of God. For example, in John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, after Jesus had just cleansed the temple, the Jews asked Jesus, "What miraculous sign do you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And of course, the temple that he's speaking about is his body. And it says, after Jesus had been raised from the dead, the disciples remember the words Jesus had spoken and they believed the scriptures about the resurrection. So Jesus claimed on numerous occasions that his resurrection from the dead would vindicate his messianic credentials. And I think that we have very strong corroborating evidence that Jesus really did make those claims about himself. And as you said, that gets my attention. If Jesus says, if Jesus is challenged, prove that you are the Messiah, and prove that you are the Son of God, prove that you have authority to do the things you're doing, prove that you have authority to claim authority over the temple as the Son of God. And Jesus says, yeah, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, speaking about the resurrection, and says that the resurrection will be the proof or the evidence, the vindication that Jesus really is who he said he was. And then, lo and behold, on the third day, he really does rise from the dead. Yeah, that grabs my attention for sure. And furthermore, the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Scriptures. You see the resurrection prophesied that it would happen in respect to the Messiah, and it would be the vindication that he was indeed God's chosen one. He was the anointed one. Let me demonstrate this. If you go to the book of Isaiah in chapter 53, written 700 years before Jesus, it speaks about the Messiah. It says, verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, right? Cut off is a Jewish idiom for to be killed, right? So he's killed, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked, so he's being buried, with the rich man in his death, though he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. So he's actually gone through death. He's been cut off from the land of the living. He's been buried. And then he sees his seed, his offspring, which I would argue are spiritual offspring, those that hope in his message are spiritual children of God. I can make a case for that. But but the point here is that the resurrection is something that's forecast in the Hebrew Scriptures. And Jesus, in claiming to be the Messiah and on the third day after his death, really that indeed, as you mentioned, really grabs my attention, and it should grab the attention of anyone as to the identity of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, soon, like I said, as soon as I heard O'Connor mention that, I was like, well, I don't think that analogy fits O'Connor, because we're talking about somebody who's been prophesied. Prophesied from years, millennia ahead of time. You know what I mean? And just that comparison just did not work. So I really do think that his analogy fails. Also, the book Isaiah is the most quoted book in the New Testament. And it's always powerful. It's always wonderful whenever I see that or whenever I read that, because like you pointed out, Isaiah 53 is a direct testimony to the Messiah, to the coming Savior. And I just think that's a powerful tool, if you will, to argue against those who come against, or argue for against those who come against the resurrection or the messiahship of Jesus Christ.
Right, and Alex gave a moral illustration. I forget exactly the example he used, but
Yeah.
he said some morally atrocious statement and said,
Right.
if I made this statement and I rose from the dead, that wouldn't prove the veracity of that particular moral statement.
Yeah.
But the hypothesis that we're putting forward is that God raised Jesus from the dead. It's not that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. It's
Right.
that God raised Jesus from the dead, and God is a morally perfect being definitionally.
Sure.
God
Yeah.
would have no reason, no motivation for raising someone from the dead in order to vindicate some morally abominable statement. So
Yeah.
the parallel really breaks down.
Yeah, and that's what exactly what I was getting to. Like his analogy just completely breaks down. It didn't make any. It didn't correlate, right? I think that was a pretty flimsy argument there. But I do want to get to the I guess the because obviously the way atheists argue, they argue and they presuppose a condition, right? When they argue, in the sense that a necessary condition in their intelligibility, you know, and you know, in my I guess my experience of one-on-one interaction, I've never had any formal debates or anything of that nature, but in my experience with interaction with one-on-one conversations with atheists, they assume this necessary precondition when they speak, and I tend to try to get them to realize that. I'm more of a presuppositional apologist in a sense, you know, in this regard. That I really want the atheists to understand that they cannot claim or they cannot borrow from the Christian worldview without I guess not really borrow from the Christian worldview. They have to assume certain aspects to be right or real and borrow from the Christian worldview. I want to get your feedback on that as far as going at Alex O'Connor with that, you know what I mean? In the sense of trying to show like, hey, you have no foundation upon what you're saying because you reject the God of the Bible. Thus, you reject the preconditions for intelligibility.
Right, sure. Well, I have to be honest. I'm not very convinced by Cornelius Van Til's whole framework. I think
right.
that I think that it has a number of deficiencies, a number of shortcomings, and I think it's predicated on at least two fallacies, namely circular reasoning and equivocation, which we can discuss if you want. As far as Christianity being a necessary precondition of rational discourse, I don't buy that. Even if that was a valid argument for theism, which I'm not convinced that it is, I don't see how it would follow that Christianity or the God of the Bible is a necessary precondition of rational discourse. Would you argue that far? Would you argue that the God of the Bible is a necessary precondition for rational discourse?
Yes, because I believe that I believe the laws of logic point to God. I believe that when we argue, and I don't want to get too far off subject, but we could chime on this for a little bit. Yeah. But I guess when I take intelligibility into consideration, I do think that obviously the laws of logic is extremely important in when we're talking about intelligibility. So I believe that the God of the Bible is the only God that we can talk about. I believe that the atheist is not neutral in their stance. I believe that they are hostile towards God and enmity, and I believe that you would agree with me in that nature, that they are hostile towards the God. I don't believe that they take a position of neutrality. And in that sense, I do believe that the God of the Bible is a necessary precondition for all intelligibility. And outside of that, there is no other God that can even come close to that or would even come close, because obviously all other gods are false, inherently false, and their doctrine is proven to be false as well.
So what about a generic deity? Why do we need to presuppose the contents of the Bible in order to be rationally grounded in logic and so forth?
Because I believe that the Bible is, you don't need to be so grounded in the Bible in the sense that that's where all the intelligibility comes from, but you do need to be grounded in the God of the Bible, because there is no way that we can deviate from that in our apologetics, because we're attempting to point them to the God of the Bible. So okay, by doing so, go ahead.
So why do you believe the God of the Bible exists?
Say again?
What brings you to the conclusion that the God of the Bible exists?
What brings the conclusion? Well, obviously there's evidence for that, but also I can do an inner testimonial existence of the God of the Bible. But to use that as evidence, I don't think would go too far, as far as self-conviction and things like that. That is obviously a subjective experience of God's experience on me. But I would say that Because this is the thing, and this is where where I feel that presuppositional arguments are strong, and that the atheist will argue from a position as if they have the rights to argue from there. I don't know if that makes sense. And what I want to do is show them, like, you are borrowing from the Christian worldview in order to position yourself to argue with me, because you cannot have a position, you cannot argue from a position unless you consider, unless you, how can I phrase it? Unless you not necessarily acknowledge that God exists, which I do believe that everybody believes that God exists. I believe they suppress the truth and unrighteousness. But it's their arguments are fallacious, and their arguments are not necessarily absurd, but their argument, well, I guess it is absurd to a degree because they discount the God of the Bible.
Okay, so why would you say that the God of the Bible's the necessary precondition and the Christian worldview, rather than simply saying they're borrowing from a theistic worldview?
Well, the God of the Bible, from his nature, flows all the laws of logic that we have. Laws of logic in the capacity that we live by, or the epistemological standard that we live by. Those are the areas that they all draw from the nature of God, of the Bible.
But what about a God that hasn't revealed himself, or kind of a deistic God from whom all the laws of logic flow? Why couldn't you propose one of those and still be grounded as far as rational discourse is concerned?
Let's say that one more time, Jonathan.
So why do you need to presuppose the biblical God rather than, say, a deistic God?
Because I think the goal of the Christian is to point them to the biblical God. I don't think we need to. I don't think it's productive in the full grand scheme of things if we're slowly progressing to a theistic position. I think we should just go full blown. We're arguing for the Christian God because
sure.
That's what we're talking about.
I agree with you that we should be pointing people to the biblical God, but we also, I think, should be honest about the limitations of our argument. So, for example, when I'm talking about the evidence of design and biology, I'm very careful to be clear that the arguments I'm presenting are evidence of design, but don't only give us evidence for the identity and nature of that designing intelligence. However, I believe that the designing intelligence is the God of the Bible, but I need additional levels of argument to get myself there. So the evidence for the resurrection, I think, bears very strongly on the case for the God of the Bible. Yeah. But the cosmological argument doesn't get you to the God of the Bible, but I think it's fair to make that argument. I'm not convinced by the transcendental argument myself, but I don't see, even in best case scenario, you can make a transcendental argument for the existence of God, but I don't see how the transcendental argument would work for the God of the Bible. I don't want to paint this picture like I'm against evidence or anything like that. I definitely feel that evidence has its place in our apologetics, but sometimes, I've listened to, those who don't necessarily prescribe to the Van Tillian way of arguing. I've listened to some arguments, and it seems to me, and this is why I lean towards the presuppositional position, is that we get too far left in our argumentation. We get too far left in the philosophical jargon and the philosophical talk, instead of just bringing the conversation back to center line on the gospel. But that's where I go with it. Obviously we all have different apologetic efforts, and we all have different apologetic methodology, and there's no love lost between our between us. But yeah, man, that's where I come from, and I feel that's a very strong place to go with it, man. And obviously, there is a place and time for evidence. You know what I mean? There is always a place for evidence. And I just think that the moral argument and the laws of logic are a part of that evidence as well. So I'm sure you do as well. So the the moral argument, I think, is a decent enough argument, though I don't think it's the strongest argument. I prefer the scientific apologetics and data, but the argument from the laws of logic, I don't think is valid. I might be wrong, but the laws of logic are hold true in every possible world. They're just true definitionally. So there's three laws of logic, as you know. This is law of non-contradiction, law of the excluded middle, the law of identity. Those are true definitionally. It's definitionally true that there are absolutely no square circles, so that A cannot be non-A in the same time in the same sense. That's just definitionally true. There's no possible world in which it could not be true. Sure. So I'm not so convinced that the laws of logic require God to exist. I think there's other really good arguments that point to the existence of God, but I'm not sure that that's one of them. But I guess we can agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, I guess my question would be to you. I do want to get to the rest of the question, but I just want to ask you this last question on the laws of logic. Where would such an abstract idea come from then, as far as the laws, if it didn't flow from the nature of God?
Well, the laws of logic, I think, are just definitionally true. I think it's just definitionally true that A cannot be non-A in the same time in the same sense. That's just true definition. In the same sense that the statement there are absolutely no married bachelors is just true definitionally, but just because what we mean by bachelor, what we mean by unmarried, right?
Yeah.
So there's so it's just true definitionally in that same way.
We got to carry this conversation though, Jonathan. I like
it. Yeah, I'd be happy to at some point do a whole show with you just on that topic.
I would love to. That's great. That's great. But I do want to get back to Alex O'Connor, man. So what are your thoughts on kind of refusal to concede his failure as far as the Lazarus? Because he talked about Lazarus, he did not take that into consideration, that there were two different stories there, and it seemed like he was trying to create a contradiction. So, what is your thoughts on the fact that he was reluctant to concede his failure to take the context into consideration?
Absolutely. So, Alex O'Connor presented three alleged contradictions in his opening statement. They all, upon further inspection, fall apart, every single one of them, and I think I demonstrated that for all three of them in the cross-examination.
You did.
They are, and I cited in the cross-examination, the God, right? We can assume, I think, fairly these are your best three examples. Otherwise, why choose these examples rather than some other three? Usually, people in debates take their best examples, not some mediocre examples. One of them is, as you mentioned, had to do with Lazarus in John 11, where Lazarus is raised dead by Jesus, and Alex O'Connor alleged that this is contradicted by Luke 16, where there's a guy called Lazarus who's not raised from the dead, who in a parable that's told by Jesus. And Alex said, see, Lazarus is raised from the dead in John, and he's not in Luke. So which is it? Depends which gospel you read. And I pointed out in the cross-examination, these are two different Lazaruses, right? It's really obvious if you read it in Luke 16, the Lazarus there is a beggar, right? They're just completely different. He basically during the cross-examination, he kind of changed his argument, even though he wasn't really acknowledging that that's what he was doing. But he changed his argument to, in John, Jesus raises a guy called Lazarus from the dead. In Luke 16, he doesn't, so Jesus acted inconsistent with himself, and therefore there's a contradiction. So he tried to argue that way and tried to save face a little bit. That argument is also abysmally bad. For one thing, Jesus isn't even present in the story. The only part where Jesus is actually involved is in telling the story. He's telling a story at an event, and we don't even know whether the story is fictitious or not. We don't know how long it happened ago. It may have happened centuries ago. We just don't know. So there's a lot of problems with that level of argument. And also, Jesus may have even been making the point that I raised Lazarus from the dead, and you want to stone him. And so he tells a story about this guy called Lazarus, and about Lazarus the rich man wanting Lazarus, who's in paradise with Abraham, to go back to his brothers to warn him not to come there. To this place, and Abraham tells them, they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. And the rich man says, but if someone is raised from the dead, it goes to them, then they'll believe. And the response he receives is, well, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not believe, even if someone raises from the dead. In other words, there's just so much abundant, overwhelming evidence from the testimony of Moses and the prophets, which forecast and predict Jesus' life, death, and resurrection centuries in advance, that itself should be sufficient evidence without raising people from the dead. Nonetheless, there are people raised from the dead, such as Lazarus in John 11, and exactly what we read about in Luke 16 is fulfilled. The people want to kill him, and they want to kill Jesus, and they don't believe as a result of the resurrection of this other Lazarus that we're told about in John 11. So the whole argument there was extremely weak, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I saw you dismantled those. You definitely dismantled those arguments, and it was just interesting how when I like I said, I've never been in a formal debate or anything like that, but whenever I view debates and watch them when they get caught, man, it's always interesting to see the reaction, and it was just clear that Connor was not ready to concede that one. I guess that's the nature of debating, but you don't want to concede it, but. Yeah, I think he would have been better off conceding that one, man, because it just really made his argument look real flimsy and deflated, Yeah. So.
And by the way, on another of his contradictions, one of them was that there's a contradiction between John 20 Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, as to how many women went to the tomb, and the Matthew, Mark, and Luke all report multiple women going to the tomb: Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Salome, etc. In John 20, verse 1, however, it says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, so the stone had been removed from the tomb." And so Alex's objection, which is basically taken from Bart Ehrman, is, well, which is it? Is it multiple women, or is it maybe just Mary Magdalene? It depends which gospel you read. There's a contradiction. But what he didn't do was read the next verse, where it says, "So she ran," this is John 20, verse 2, "So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus sent. They had taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we," plural pronoun, "do not know where they have laid him." And so John's word usage there indicates that he knows, and Mary Magdalene knows, that there were other women present with Mary when she went to the tomb early on Easter morning. And so the argument, again, just falls apart on a simple reading of the context of these verses.
Yeah, context is absolutely... It's very imperative that we read the context and understand what the text is saying. And I think Alex O'Connor would have did well if he would have took the context in consideration. He probably would have left that argument alone. But I do want to get on. I know that when he had his opportunity to go up there and present his opening statement and things and present his position of why he's an atheist, he fell on the moral aspects of it. He essentially put himself in the judgment seat of God and was judging God morally. He pointed out some of the atrocities, if you will, or some of what he might define as atrocities. And he said, well, these are the reasons why I'm an atheist, because essentially God is a moral monster. So I wanted to get your feedback on why not press him on that, just to sort of say, where I think that you don't, because I noticed that it seemed like you began to press him on it a little bit, and then he threw he said, oh, that's I forget what fallacy that he mentioned that he said he was, but it seems as if you said, well, okay, fair enough, and you continue with your other arguments. I was hoping that you would have pressed him a little bit more on that moral stand, because once again, if atheists believe what they believe that, basically it's chemistry firing off in the mind, you know what I mean? So if we don't have any soul, anything of that nature, any moral compass, if you will, from the transcendent aspect of it, what moral basis is he arguing from?
Yeah, I did press him a bit on that. The reason I moved on was because I wanted to actually address his questions rather than get the impression that I was dodging them. So that's why I only pressed it, because it was only a short cross-examination period of 13 minutes.
Sure.
I respect that he'd asked questions, and so I wanted to actually address them rather than turn it into my cross-examination period.
Sure,
but
sure.
So I pressed him on that briefly. He made the point, which I think is okay, which is fine, that he's presenting an internal critique of Christianity. So even if he's not able to object to ground ethical norms, I believe that there are ethical norms, and so he's pointing to an alleged inconsistency in my own position, which is fair. So I turned to address these passages. The first one he brought up was this about slaves in the Old Testament. He brought up Exodus 21,
Mm-hmm.
and the verse he brought up was verse 20 and 21. When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So the objection is, okay, if the slave master beats his slave and he dies within a day or two, he's to be punished, but there's no punishment if he gets up within a day or two. So you can beat a slave essentially within an inch of death, and you get off scot-free, and so you can abuse your slave in that way. And that was the objection. This is morally reprehensible, and so that's why he rejects Christianity. There's some problems with that. If you continue reading, for example, and by the way, the Hebrew word that's translated avenged or punished is the Hebrew word that really means the death penalty. So if the slave dies, then the slave master gets put to death as penalty. It's slave if you beat a slave to death. But if you look at just the immediate context, get to verse 26, and I pointed this out in the debate. When a man strikes the eye of a slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. So there is, in fact, a punishment for abusing a slave such that you cause permanent or long-lasting bodily harm, right? So there most certainly is a penalty for mistreatment of a slave. By the way, slavery, at least in Hebrew slavery, which you read about in the Old Testament, it's very, very different from the North American Negro slave trade that we are all abhorred by, that occurred in the 19th century. It was often people would sell themselves into debts to pay, sell themselves into slavery to pay off debts that they could not pay otherwise. Servitude. So then he brought up another text, which was number 31. And this actually, at the time, hadn't really studied in depth, and so I had to concede that this was a strong point, and I later addressed it in a video which was posted on my YouTube channel, where he brought up Numbers 31, which he alleged condoned sexual slavery or rape of war captives. And verse 18 and following, Moses and Eleazar, the priests, and all the chiefs of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands, and the commanders of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor, and so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known men by lying with him, for yourselves. And so the idea here is that these women are being kept as war captives, and they are to be raped and treated as sexual slaves. And this, of course, is morally reprehensible, and therefore Alex would argue we should reject Christianity. But it is a difficult passage on first blush. However, when you begin to look at the context a bit more carefully, although it is still a difficult passage, it's much less difficult than it first appears. The issue here, that what Moses is alluding to here, is that these women of Midian have enticed people of Israel, the men of Israel, into sexual sin. That's why it says, have you let all the women live? Behold, these on Balaam's advice caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. You can read about this in Numbers 25. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. And so then the command is to kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. You have not known man by lying with him. So in other words, they were not involved in this sin of bringing the men of Israel into sexual immorality. They were to keep them alive for themselves. So they were to be married into the Israelite community. And so they're spared death. They are marrying into the people of Israel. They are then introduced to the one true God. They are introduced to the God of Israel and the customs of God's people. Furthermore, when you read when we read in the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 21, we have some further elaboration on what it is to be a female war captive. This is from verse 10. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So there are, in fact, very careful regulations given for the marriage of female war captives. Mm-hmm. They're to be given a full month to mourn and lament the loss of her father and mother, during which she's not to be even touched. And if the husband does not delight in her, he is to let her go without selling her as a slave, treating her as a slave, because he's humiliated her. So there's careful regulations stipulated for the treatment of such women. Mm-hmm. Furthermore, if the woman is to be if the woman did not want to enter into one of these marriages to one of the Israelite soldiers, then what was to be her fate? Was she to be forced into these marriages? We don't know. It's speculation either way. And so the passage becomes much less difficult than it initially first appears. One further point, in fact, is that even on the most difficult reading of this text, it's actually Moses that's giving the instruction, not the God of Israel. And so one could even argue that Moses is going off script at this point, that it's Moses' command rather than God's. There's another line of defense that one could argue for. So there's just a few thoughts on that. If you have anything to add, but that's just my tuppence worth.
Yeah, and one thing I would love to commend you on though is because I think it's important as an apologist, someone who endeavors in apologetics and takes on a lot of opponents, and you definitely took on your fair share of opponents, and the fact that you are a very experienced apologist and you was willing to admit where you say, well, I need to better understand that, or, well, that's a good point. I think that's a wonderful thing, in the sense that the humility that's needed, and the fact that we don't know everything, and there's no reason for a believer in Christ to behave as if we do know everything. A part of our apologetics is the character and the integrity that you present to those who do not believe. And we're told in the book of Matthew to be the salt and light of the world, and I think that's a part of it. And be able to show that humility that God has graced you with. And I do appreciate that. So when I saw that, I was like, that's cool, man. You know what I mean? That's what's up. And I appreciate that aspect of your position. And another thing is that, atheists tend to argue, especially when it comes to women. They tend, I guess my point is when it comes to arguing for the women of the Bible, they tend to argue and not take the full scope of the historical background into consideration. One aspect that I've noticed is that they claim that women were treated, as second-class citizens, and they were just demoralized and things like that. And I'm like, yeah, they probably was to a degree treated in the sense that men had the authority, and the men authority were seen more, I guess, more powerful, if you will, in that context. But to say that women are treated in this demoralized, horrible fashion would be just a total misrepresentation of not only the nature of God, who God has established his law within the tribe of Israel, but also it takes away from the people of Israel and themselves of how they behave. You know what I mean? And I just think whenever atheists make those arguments, it's kind of like it's expected. They're doing whatever they can to try to deflate God, try to take away God, his word and everything. So, yeah, once again, I just appreciate you being humble in that nature, in that sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess you already answered the question about the Numbers 31, so that was a good response. So you made the statement that evidence was the reason before your faith. Right? I guess wasn't in your closing statement. No, I think it was in your opening statement, right? Because you said you were a staunch evidentialist. Mm-hmm. So, I think it was your opening statement. So, in that, being that Connor did not accept the evidence, do you think just evidence-based faith in that sense did not just push him further away from the faith? Because he already rejects the evidence.
No, I think the Bible actually prescribes us to have an evidence-based faith and just believe. Numerous passages throughout the Old and New Testament which do this. If you look at, for example, in Deuteronomy 18, what are the qualifications for being a true prophet of God? One that can consistently forecast the future ahead of time, right? If you're a true prophet, you can consistently forecast the future. If you do not accurately forecast the future on a consistent basis, then Deuteronomy says that the prophet has spoken presumptuously, and you need not be afraid of him. In fact, he was to be put to death.
Sure.
Furthermore, if you look at the book of Isaiah and chapter number 41, it says from verse 21, God speaks about the utility of idols, and he actually rebukes the idolaters, saying, "Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is less than nothing, and abomination is he who chooses you." So again, God actually challenges the idolaters to bring forth evidences that they're really representing true gods. And it turns out they cannot predict the future the way that the God of Israel can predict the future. And so the prophecies become evidence that the God of the Bible has spoken. Likewise, in Matthew 11, for example, in the New Testament, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus to ask him, "Are you the one we're expecting, the Messiah? Should we expect another?" Jesus says, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. And so he actually quotes Isaiah 35 concerning the signs you expect to see when Yahweh saves. But the evidence is there to go and report back to John. And there's numerous passages throughout the Gospels, the book of Acts. We even read about scientific apologetics in the Bible. For example, in Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Yep. In Romans 1, Paul describes the unbeliever as literally without an apologetic because of the manifestation of God's nature and attributes in nature, in the created world. So Scripture actually prescribes for us to use evidence. Indeed, I'm not sure what other approach one could adopt. You mentioned a presuppositionalist approach, but I imagine Alex probably would not be persuaded by your presuppositionalist approach either. So what approach would you suppose that we should take that would assuage that particular concern?
No, it's not really a particular approach that I prescribe. I'm a precept, man. So obviously I lean towards that, but but like I said, I do agree with you. I do agree with you, and I do agree that evidence does have its very nice place in apologetics and debating.
Sure, It just seems to me that your objection would apply equally well to your own methods of presuppositionalism if Alex were not to be convinced by your presuppositional approach. Yeah, so it seems that it's a double-edged sword.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I'm sure that, if he didn't say my position would I guess quote unquote fail in the sense that he wouldn't agree with it. But do I think that my presuppositional argument would push him further from the faith? No, and I don't think you do either, right?
I actually do tend to think that because, I think if I was a non-Christian, the presuppositionalist method would push me further away from the faith because I find it so weak and unconvincing.
Jonathan, no, man, no. See, we're gonna have to have a conversation about this, man. We're gonna have to have an hour-long show sometime in the future about this one, man. But okay. Yeah, I really do believe that presuppositional apologetics is a strong place. I think it's a strong methodology. I really do believe that, and I found it to be very, 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 I guess, strong. I can't think of any other term to use, but I do think it's a very strong way to argue for the existence of God. And I think I don't want to go too deep into this, man, but it is all good. But though your methodology is strong, and I don't want you to think that I don't think it's strong. It's good, man. It's good stuff, man. So, and with that said, all the questions and all the evidence versus pre-sub and things like that, and Alex O'Connor and his reluctancy to concede defeat in certain areas, that is not even the most important thing. The most important thing is the gospel, right? So,
absolutely.
What is the gospel truth? If you can run that down for me real quick. What is the gospel truth?
Absolutely. So the gospel, God is absolutely perfect, without flaw, without sin, and he is maximally good, and that means he's maximally just. And so he must come against sin with perfect righteousness and judgment and holiness. God cannot turn a blind eye to sin. And the Bible says we've all sinned. We've all fallen short of God's standards, his law. And that becomes clear when we just look, when we peruse through the Ten Commandments, for example. How many of us have not stolen or lied during our lives, or looked at someone with lustful intent, or taken the name of the Lord in vain, or hide idol. I mean, and that's just a small selection of the commandments in God's law. And so if we've all sinned and we've all violated God's law, then that puts us in a terrible predicament or situation, because since God is just, he must justly condemn us to an eternity of separation from his favorable presence. And so because God is maximally good, he's not only just, but he's also maximal in love. And because of God's tremendous love for us, he extends his mercy towards us in providing for us a substitute to pay the penalty for our sins. And that substitute turns out to be the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the second person of the triune Godhead. We believe that God is one but complex in his unity, and that within the essence of God there are three distinct persons, namely the Father, Son, and Spirit. The second of those persons, namely the Son, 2,000 years ago walked among us in the person of Jesus Christ, being fully God and yet also fully man, having two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. He went to the cross of Calvary, and on that cross of Calvary, he absorbed the judgment of a righteous and holy God in our stead, such that we could be legally acquitted before him. So we violated God's law, and Jesus paid our penalty, our debt, with his own life's blood on the cross, such that when he cried out, "Tetelestai" on the cross, meaning it is accomplished or it is finished, it is as though he turned over that cup of divine fury, and not one single drop fell out, for he consumed it right down to the very dregs. And so the gospel is that if we repent of our sin, turn from our sin, flee from our sin and unrighteousness, and trust in the merits of Christ alone, throwing ourselves at the foot of the cross for mercy, then we can be legally acquitted before our just and holy God. We can be made right with God. We can have peace with God and enjoy an eternity of fellowship with him. That is the gospel.
Amen, amen. Thank you for that, man. And that's, once again, as I've been saying throughout the show, is that it's always the center point of the gospel, where we want to hit where we want to go to, and our apologetics should always be gospel centered. And if our apologetics is not gospel centered, we're just like what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that we're just like clanging cymbals, if you will. You know what I mean? Just this pointless, unsound ringing that makes no sense. So as long as our apologetics is gospel centered, I think we're on track. I think we're in a good place, man. But yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for joining me on The Gospel Truth. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your efforts. Once again, we are praying for you, and we're praying for your ministry and everything. And just go ahead, keep putting them arguments under the feet of Christ, man. And just keep deflating those arguments, man. Keep doing your thing.
Oh, thank you so much. You too.
All right. Oh, once again, where can everybody find your information?
At apologetics-academy.org. They can also find me on YouTube. Type in my name, Jonathan McLatchie, or also Apologetics Academy. You'll find my two YouTube channels there. You can also add me on Facebook or Twitter. All
right. Thank you once again, Jonathan, for joining me. And once again, I'm praying for you. And you keep doing your thing. And have safe travels, too. I see you all over the place, man. So be safe out there, and be prayed up. And we're praying for you and your safe travels and everything.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. All right, folks. Mr. Jonathan McLatchie, and he came on and put the put the smash down on them atheistic arguments. It was a good discussion. We got a little precept in and some little evidentialist clash, going on. And I'm gonna look forward to trying to get Jonathan back on to see if we can talk about this a little bit more. But I just once again want to thank Jonathan for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth, and I look forward to talking to him in the future, and hope he's blessed out there and be safe out there. So once again, go ahead and like and follow this page, The Gospel Truth, on Facebook, and also you can like and follow and subscribe on YouTube as well. And don't forget to cut those notification bells on so you get notified whenever I upload new content and whenever I go live. So once again, thank you for joining me on this installment of The Gospel Truth. I hope you're blessed, and thank you for joining me once again. God bless. Bye.